and into asylum, like a great black engine roaring to eternity, ravaging the already benighted landscape with its savage, malevolent presence. And within the legions of the truly damned, insanity, sheer and stark, and once in human form, now gutted and torn by eons of glutted indulgence. Their bloodlust flecking the oily walls, living in the shrieks of victims ensnared, hanged, drawn, and quartered by the serpent's squalid writhings. This is the place I have not wanted to dream of, and the dream is now the place I partly live through.
Well, that's certainly charming. Enter the world of Shadow Man, a place where lower gods gaze down upon the world, both living and dead, and where lost souls wander the paths of shadow to protect our world from the evils of the other side of the veil. A lineage of immortal voodoo warriors called Shadow Men enter the realms of the dead to combat whatever darkness gathers there. Sounds like a promising concept, right? Well, it was enough to get me interested. Shadow Man is an action-adventure game published by Acclaim Entertainment and developed by a subsidiary studio in Teesside. It was originally supposed to release in early '99 for PC and Nintendo 64, but was pushed back to August later that year, and was also ported to the PlayStation on launch day. I'm going to be focusing on the PC version of the game for the purposes of this review, partially because I'm a PC-focused gaming channel, and partially because I feel that it's the best version out there, despite some significant differences between that and the N64 version, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So what is Shadow Man exactly? Well, it started off as a comic book originally released in 1992 by Valiant Comics, and it quickly rose to a position of prominence in the industry. After a single year of publication, Shadow Man was selling over 100,000 books a month, and by its second year, it was outselling long-standing industry stalwarts from Marvel and DC. Needless to say, Shadow Man was a bit of a big deal. Such a big deal, in fact, that Acclaim Entertainment bought Valiant in 1996, reportedly for $65 million, and promptly started working on turning this page-turner into a video game franchise. To coincide with this, they launched a new line of comic books featuring a brand new protagonist, Michael Loa. Things were going so well for the company, in fact, that in 1999, they were even approached by Ice Cube, yeah, that Ice Cube, with a pitch to make a Shadow Man movie. But Acclaim was so focused on releasing the video game that they flat out turned him down. It was a decision that really could have gone either way. But in the end, I think Acclaim made the right call because Shadow Man is a game that is surprisingly robust and well crafted. Looking at the screenshots, it comes off as a bit of a generic corridor shooter, but once you get into it, you'll find expansive environments that play similarly to Soul Reaver. It places a lot of emphasis on exploration with a little bit of puzzle solving, all wrapped up in the sort of dark, voodoo, creepy trappings that you would expect when you're playing as an immortal voodoo warrior who regularly travels to this world and the world of the dead to explore the horrors to be found there. And it's also definitely a product of its time, that's for certain. But it still has that sort of polish and attention to detail that allows it to age at least somewhat gracefully. Many of its aspects may feel dated, however, the game does hold up really well, and I found myself deeply immersed in it, thanks in no small part to the fantastic atmosphere and dark tone. While not a horror title per se, it certainly has enough horror themes scattered about to make any fan of the creepy trolleys feel right at home. As for Shadow Man, well, prepare to embrace the shadows as I take you down a road deep into the heart of the underworld. This is Shadow Man. Let's get the visuals out of the way first. Now, keeping in mind that this is a game from 1999, it looks more or less how you expect it to. Textures are highly compressed and stretched out, and everything looks really blurry and muddy. You can even see where the texture maps begin and end on certain background objects. Now, I don't know how much of this was due to console limitations, given that it was being simultaneously developed for both PC and N64 back in the day, but at least on the PC version, the textures look a little better since you can change your resolution options and set environmental details to high. What's nice is that you get widescreen support right out of the box with this one too, so you don't need to tinker with the INI files to get it running on a modern PC. However, vertical FOV is decreased with widescreen, and while this doesn't affect the gameplay at all, the game's cutscenes don't scale properly and the camera tends to cut off character models. But the PC version also has working cloth physics, such as they are, so, worthwhile trade-off. Individual textures may look flat, but when looked at together, they create a much more coherent image, thanks due in no small part to some very good art direction. One thing about Shadow Man is for certain, it's a game that oozes atmosphere. Shadow Man excels at creating environments with aesthetic consistency despite lackluster technology, and it makes the whole thing really impressive given that this was the 5th generation of consoles that we're talking about here. And while Shadow Man isn't a horror game per se, it relies heavily on horror elements in order to create a highly evocative world that's very memorable. The game's largest area is the Nightmare Palace, known as the Asylum, which itself is divided among a number of different sub-areas. Its lava ducts and gateway underbelly ferry the liquid magma used to power the machines in the engine block, which allow for the Cathedral of Pain to act as the link between Dead Side and Live Side. These are all sub-areas of the game, but they all have a little piece that makes up the bigger picture. Each of these areas have their own quirks and distinct features that make them feel as if they're on their own, but they each retain the consistency of this large industrial fortress located in the heart of the underworld, and as a result, none of them seem as if they're placed there for the sake of just being there. This design mentality extends to all of the areas in the game, and with some great effects too. Ancient temples that contain the power of the Loa feel like undisturbed monuments that double as your puzzle platforming sections a la 3D Zelda game. And despite reusing different assets, their layouts and themes are structured in such a way that it doesn't feel like it's lazily put together. As far as some of the game's creepiest areas go, none stand out more than your foray into Morden Street, New York City. Furthermore, the visual design extends to the game's enemies as well, some of which are the stuff of nightmares. Aside from the standard zombie enemies, because it is the land of the dead after all, you have these large luchador-esque pig guards all over the asylum who have managed to startle me on more than one occasion, especially placed in a corner just beyond your sight ready to ambush you. Not to mention that there are these dog-men experiments wearing gimp masks and Herculean true forms created as big bad killing machines. These enemies, and Shadow Man too, all have some decent animations that, while not fantastic, are adequate. And the game even has some rudimentary lip-syncing during some of the cutscenes.
Sounds like a cue for a song, but this ain't no musical. Give me the blade.
Of course, it isn't perfect, but it's a great touch to try and at least push the technological capabilities of the game. Quaint by today's standards, but pretty neat for the time. The game's presentation is also heavily serviced by its fantastic audio design too, which bolsters the game's general atmosphere. Aside from a very moody soundtrack that encapsulates the strange, otherworldly place that Dead Side is, it also encompasses heavy, industrial-influenced tracks to drive home the machinery of the asylum. Many of the level themes even incorporate various sound loops that add just that little bit of extra that drives home the sense of dismay that you're supposed to feel as you witness the horrors of the asylum around you. The aptly named playrooms, for instance, which are really the laboratories for the asylum surgeons to construct the abominations that they throw at you, have these looping sounds of buzzsaws and screams layered on top of an otherwise innocuous-sounding children's playroom chime, which makes the whole thing sound all the more creepy. My favorite tracks, however, are the ones used for the game's voodoo temples, which all still have those same esoteric soundscapes, but are grounded in a much more mysterious tribal vibe. It sort of reminds me of the Shadow Temple from Ocarina of Time, which is kind of appropriate when you think about it. Overall, Shadow Man's presentation is top-notch, especially considering the time when this game originally came out. Despite its veneer of being a late 90s 3D game, a lot of its core aesthetic elements hold up really well. It manages to really nail that horror ambience that helps it stand out among other action-adventure platformers, because it has some really great design. As for the game's plot, what you get is something serviceable, but also far less memorable. The game opens up with a cutscene of Jack the Ripper hiding away in a London sewer, writing his memoirs in a journal. He's then visited by a strange, otherworldly entity known as Legion, who recruits Jack to build him a fortress, the Asylum, in Deadside, which is the place where all souls go upon death. Legion's plan is to gather 5 like-minded individuals, all sadistic serial killers from all different times, and empower them using the Dark Souls, ancient souls that are the source of immortality, or something like that. These killers are to act as Legion's generals, and they will lead the armies being bred in the Asylum over to Liveside and usher in the apocalypse on Earth. Fast forward to 1999, Mama Nettie, a voodoo priestess, awakens from a nightmare in which she sees everything that I just talked about unfold in a prophetic vision. She wakes up our hero, Michael Lewa, and tells him to travel to Deadside and prepare for the coming evil. Michael, the latest in a long line of undead voodoo warriors known as the Shadow Men, does this by collecting the Dark Souls scattered throughout the world, awakening his voodoo powers in ancient temples, and collecting various artifacts in order to stand a chance when he confronts the 5 and eventually Legion himself. No furtive pygmies here, but yes, you are actually collecting Dark Souls as a part of the game's plot, which tickled me quite a bit jumping into it. Now, that's a lot to take in, but if you forget any of that information, don't worry. There's an in-game item called the Book of Prophecy that you find really early in the game, and it recaps all of this, including your untimely death against the final boss. Like, way to give me a chance here, game. Now, what's interesting about this is that this acts as a sort of in-game hint book. Not only does it highlight what your general objectives are, and it foreshadows the scope of the plot, but it also gives you information on some of the items and abilities you can get in the game. Find a new piece of equipment and you're not sure what it does? Open up the Book of Prophecy and you'll get some broad insight or some kind of a general hint. Now, while the overall plot might not be too original or not anything to write home about really, what it does is really successfully make even the most minor of details that accent this plot feel like they're meaningful. Like, let me give you an example. In that opening cutscene, the one with Jack the Ripper writing in his journal, the journal that he's writing in is an actual in-game item that you can acquire once you figure out how to reach that area. And not only does his journal outline the machines in the asylum, detail its building process, and shed some light into the experiments going on within it to create that true form army, which makes absolute sense since he's the architect of such an institution, but this item also acts as a hint that explains how to solve the game's final puzzle in order to reach the final boss. The way it comes together logically is just such a nice thing, and the way that the devs paid attention to these little details really makes it seem like there's a lot of care put into all these plot elements. As a result, most every item you find in Shadow Man feels as if it has some significance, and by making those in-game journals act as reference guides to help you along the way if you get lost, it's a seamless way to blend lore with actual hints that further encourages you to not only interact with everything, but also explore every nook and cranny to see what the game has to offer. And this narrative hook directly ties into the way that Shadow Man approaches its gameplay. Shadow Man is very much an action-adventure title where exploration and item collection are the norms. Generally speaking though, Shadow Man sets a tone that is immediately apparent if you're familiar with games like Tomb Raider or Soul Reaver. You're dropped into this big semi-open world, and it's your job to navigate it in order to find your ability upgrades, items, and those aforementioned Dark Souls. This gameplay pillar is perhaps the biggest one that Shadow Man has to offer, and as a result, it's what you'll be spending most of your time doing. The game's world itself is broken up into several sub-areas, most of which you can access through the game's main hub. The only caveat is that in order to reach some of these areas, you'll need to have obtained a certain number of Dark Souls in order to open up the coffin gates that seal their entrances. I'll get into this a little bit more later. Aside from that, you traverse the game from a third-person perspective, avoiding environmental obstacles, and fighting any of the creepy denizens of the Deadlands as you go. Now, controlling Michael takes a little bit of getting used to since it doesn't use the standardized control scheme you might be familiar with. I played Shadow Man using an Xbox One controller, and once I mapped out the buttons to resemble its PlayStation counterpart, it works just fine. However, you'll soon realize that there are a few things that you naturally want to do with the controller that the game doesn't allow. That's because Shadow Man uses D input instead of X input. In other words, you don't have any right stick or analog trigger functionality at all. In fact, sometimes the game won't even launch if it detects the controller that you're using as an X input mode. So, the game has some awkward control functions, like spinning the camera around. Under normal circumstances, the camera will always stick behind Michael, regardless of which direction he faces. In order to see Michael's surroundings a little bit better, you'll need to hold down one of the buttons on your controller and rotate your control stick until the camera snaps to a new angle or zooms away from Michael's body. While this can be handy for leaping onto ledges behind you or getting a better look at your surroundings, it doesn't change the controller's point of reference while moving, which makes actually using it more trouble than it's worth. And because of the awkward implementation of this camera rotation, it is utterly useless during combat. Now, another interesting aspect of the game's controls is the fact that Michael's ambidextrous, and you can equip one item in each of Michael's hands. While this sounds fairly banal, in reality it has some pretty serious impacts on gameplay. For one thing, it means that you can use two items in unison, such as wielding two different weapons to mow down enemies quickly, or by having a main hand item and a utility item handy to make exploration easier. Now, as neat as this system is, it's also a bit of a two-edged sword. Switching items between both hands is a bit arduous, and it requires you to open up the inventory screen every single time you want to equip a new weapon. It's not that it's a problem per se, but swapping items frequently pauses the gameplay, especially since one of your item slots will almost always be taken up by your pistol, which is your bread and butter. The other issue, well, more of a nitpick really, is that you can't actually shimmy across ropes or hold onto ledges while having both of those items equipped at the same time. In fact, you can't even shimmy across ropes with one item equipped. You actually have to hit the associated button to holster your weapons before you're able to actually do this. While I like that this takes into consideration the dual wield mechanic, it translates to just having to press another button before going about your business in a way that most any other game would just let you do automatically. But that also means that you have another button dedicated to holstering your weapons. And this comes in handy because some items, such as the flambeau, constantly drain your shadow power while you're wielding them. However, health, ammo, and shadow power pickups are all very plentiful in Shadow Man, and I never found myself low on resources at any real point. In fact, most items you find consume shadow power, but in different ways. The items that you find usually have a dual purpose, like weapons and utilities. That aforementioned flambeau, for instance, can be used to shoot a group of fireballs at enemies, incinerating them, or you can hold it as a makeshift torch. And you'll probably need that item frequently because Shadow Man can be dark, and I don't mean that in terms of its atmosphere, although I think it really does manage to nail down that aspect wonderfully. No, I mean that literally. There are places in the game that are often too dark to see in, and the game doesn't let you adjust gamma. This is an intentional design decision, however, because the game does have items that light these areas up. But the game also doesn't distinguish between a main hand item and an offhand item, meaning that you can set it up however you want. With one button dedicated to each hand, you can flip them at will. The combinations that you create with these weapons are interesting. However, it's hard to shake the feeling that they were developed as utilities first, and then the developers tried to figure out how to make them feel more worthwhile, which led to their combat functions. I found that for my playthrough, the only time I felt I absolutely needed to use these items as weapons was for the final boss fight. Every other time, it was just to kind of experiment to see what they'd do. And being that the game doesn't really do much to iterate for the sort of platformers that it emulates, combat is a fairly major aspect of Shadow Man's gameplay, and it doesn't do too much to make itself interesting. As you explore the world, you'll run into a series of enemies that are increasingly more grotesque and challenging. However, there's very little separating them mechanically from one another. Some will attack you with melee weapons, some with projectiles, and some will float while firing projectiles. None of them have any distinct resistances or weaknesses, and so fighting them consists of charging up your spirit gun and shooting them until they vanish into a ball of light and leave behind a health pickup. That is, if you kill them with your spirit gun. Killing them with anything else just causes their bodies to burn and you don't get any health. So the challenge in the game's combat is derived more from those aforementioned camera movements and their implementation into the game. And as you may expect, it's not the good kind of challenge. There's no real ability to dodge or weave around enemies, predominantly due to that fixed camera position. Sure, you have the ability to roll out of the way, but the camera doesn't even shift around to give you a view from behind. The only way to reorient your view is to use that previously mentioned camera rotation, but doing so in combat is a surefire way to get yourself killed. Nor do you really have any way to block any sort of attacks until much later in the game when you get an item that allows you to do so. But like everything else, this relies on your voodoo powers, so you can only use it for a short amount of time before its defensive properties become useless. The best way to defeat enemies, therefore, is to just circle strafe around them and pop them full of lead, or spirit primarily, until they keel over. Usually this is a non-issue, but there are a lot of instances where Shadow Man likes to throw you into a series of closed hallways that just limits your maneuverability, and it makes this tactic a lot trickier to pull off. Plus the game has a penchant to throw several mobs at you at once, and if you're not careful with your aggro, you can easily get overwhelmed. But the nice thing about Shadow Man is that at the very least, you're an immortal voodoo warrior, which means that you essentially have unlimited lives. So every time you die, you respawn either back at the beginning of the area or the last warp point that you've unlocked within the area. Occasionally this leads to a lot of backtracking, especially if you haven't progressed far enough to unlock those warp points, but at least any enemies that you've killed in the area that you're in don't actually respawn until you leave and come back. So you don't have to worry about trying to get through them all over again like if this was Dark Souls or something. Beyond that, the combat doesn't really change much at all as the game goes on. It's fairly repetitive, and the item pickups that you get don't do much else to freshen up the experience. Sure, some weapon restrictions come into play, like not being allowed to use firearms in Deadside, and the new equipment does give you some new tricks, but fundamentally, the way that you fight enemies doesn't change at all from beginning to end. The only exception to this are the Gargantuan True Forms, who, despite being much tougher and dealing much more damage than any other common enemy you find, still aren't all that difficult to deal with, and the game's boss fights. While these two types of encounters do bring some much needed variety to the combat formula, even then they don't really change anything all that much either. You're still dealing with the same sort of tactics that you would with any other enemy, except that perhaps their patterns are a little bit different. I found that most of the 5 were easily disposed of using machine guns akimbo and shredding them to bits until they kneeled over, waiting to be finished off by my spirit gun. There are 2 exceptions to this, however. The first is the fight against Jack the Ripper. He's actually a really interesting fight because he'll crawl around on the ceiling and pounce you before trying to live up to his name and shred you open with knives. This is unlike any other fight in the game and immediately much more engaging because of it. The problem is that the fight is made much more difficult because of how awkward those camera controls are, and the fact that Jack will constantly drop down behind you and then chase you. It's very difficult to correctly orientate yourself so that you're not constantly on the defensive, and it makes for an engagement that feels just a bit unfair. I tried using first-person mode to pop him while he was on the ceiling, but that doesn't work so well either because, as you may have guessed, first-person mode makes you stationary. It's great for sniping enemies from a distance, not so great here. The second was the final boss, Legion, only because the difficulty spike skyrockets by the time you get to him. His first phase is no issue at all, but then he turns into this flying eldritch monstrosity, and that's where everything goes bonkers. He has these ranged attacks that hurt a lot and are nigh unavoidable by any regular means, but it's not too bad when you circle strafe. However, doing that means that you lose focus on the boss because he floats in the air, and the arena is fought on a series of catwalks that leads down to a pit with a bunch of health and ammo pickups. If you fall down here, there's a great ramp that can take you back up to the top level, but then you're left vulnerable to his attacks. Again, the camera makes this fight more tricky than it should be, and the lock-on targeting only does so much. I figured out a way to cheese him by standing on the platforms about halfway down, which caused him to remain relatively level to me so I wouldn't lose sight of him. Then I just dealt with him the same as every other boss, and with the added action of blocking his attacks as much as I could. This was the only strategy that I could find that actually worked against him, which led me to think that, maybe he could have been a little bit better designed. And as flat as the combat is, I find it to be generally forgivable in my mind. Primarily because Shadow Man is a game that's very aware of what it does well, and spends a lot more time grounding its gameplay in its strengths. Combat is a necessary element by virtue of the fact that most video games of this type, from this era, saw enemies as the main obstacle that players needed to overcome. So, it's whatever. On the flip side, Shadow Man thankfully puts much greater emphasis on exploration than any other facet of its gameplay, and the game is made so much stronger because of it. Not only because Shadow Man manages to be a very highly atmospheric game that compels you to keep exploring in order to reveal its mysteries to you, but because its exploration elements are handled very competently, and they actually encourage you to search every nook and cranny of the game's world. But despite actively doing a good job of encouraging this on its own with some good level design, something I'll talk about in just a bit, a major reason for this is that it's forced upon you by the game itself. In Shadow Man, many of the later stages of the game, and thus many of the items that you find to help you conquer the forces of darkness, are hidden behind those various coffin gates spread throughout the world. In order to open up these coffin gates, you need to have collected a certain amount of Dark Souls along your journey. The catch here is that some of these areas house mission critical items, and therefore they're required to be visited by you. Some of these areas are locked behind coffin gates with as much as 9 soul power out of 10, and with the ranking system that Shadow Man uses to calculate how many Dark Souls possessed translates to soul power, that means you'll need to find at least 95 of the 120 Dark Souls that populate Shadow Man's world. As a result, finding these Dark Souls isn't so much of a bonus that you do for its own sake, but rather it's crucial in order to have the necessary requirements in order to finish the game. But that's a lot less sinister than it sounds. Shadow Man cleverly masks this in such a way that hunting for these Dark Souls doesn't necessarily feel as much of a chore as it sounds on paper, and this is chiefly because the actual level compositions of Shadow Man are just so well done. There's plenty of meat on the bone and plenty of little things to find in each area. They're also very large, which means that there's always something lurking around the corner. You never feel overwhelmed by the size of them, but you don't feel that they're cramped and overly small either. Oftentimes you'll be exploring an area trying to find either the next coffin gate or the next hidden Dark Soul, and you'll come across another area that you know is an obstacle, but you don't have the means to overcome just yet. If you keep looking, eventually you'll stumble upon that which you seek, but those hidden pathways are made obvious by environmental clues, stand out in your mind, and act as reminders for you to go back to the area once you have the requisite equipment. More often than not, that just means you'll have a greater number of Dark Souls to collect, a figure that you can easily be reminded of anytime you open up the warp screen. And also, finding Dark Souls themselves isn't too troubling of a task. They're hidden and they're spread out, but they're not so hidden that you'll be scratching your head as to how to obtain them. Many times the way to get to them won't seem obvious at first, but with a little bit of poking around, especially when you return to an area with new equipment, they'll reveal themselves to you. Take for instance this windmill puzzle right here. Now, in order to even access this area, you'll need a special piece of equipment that you find much later in the game. Then if you backtrack to one of the game's starting areas, you'll find this wooden walkway with a platform overlooking a large gap, and a Dark Soul on the other side. Up ahead in the distance, you'll see a building. Poking around this area, you'll also find a hidden entrance to the other side, and thus you'll begin your ascent on the building. Not only will you manage to find a couple of Dark Souls on your way, but if you make it to the top, you can redirect the windmill's fan so it pushes the platform across the mountains that you saw before. Backtrack to the previous area, and the platform is now moving, letting you reach that previously unobtainable Govi jar you just saw before. Shadow Man is filled with instances like these. Perhaps not quite as grandly interconnected, but it nonetheless creates interlocking areas that rewards patient exploration and backtracking. These kinds of contextual clues are hidden throughout the entirety of the game, and they act as a constant prod to get you to go back and see what else is tucked away in those respective areas. Sometimes they'll be in the form of Dark Souls that are just out of reach, or others past an impassable obstacle. However, their constant presence is enough to wet the whistle of most any explorer and prod them to see what else is there. Encouraging players to organically return to previous areas and explore them further is well integrated into the game. And while it might be irritating to lock players behind progress and to force them to get a certain number of collectibles in order to progress, I think Shadow Man handles this pretty well. While it certainly pads out the game's length, it doesn't beat you over the head with what feels like unnecessary filler either. Nor does the game hold your hand either. Despite offering some in-game clues in the form of that Book of Prophecy and having NPCs occasionally divulge some information that you need to interpret, Shadow Man largely leaves you to your own devices. There was a boss fight that I encountered early on that I found was impossible to beat, and I couldn't figure out what the hell I was doing wrong. But it was only after I returned to one of the NPCs who told me what's going on and gave me what was to become my next objective. That cutscene is only available, however, if you encounter the boss and then return to the NPC, meaning that it's on you to try and solve the problem rather than letting the game prod you into doing it. Even mission-critical items such as the extractors, which aren't even explained in the game at all until well into the finale when you've already discovered what they do, they're hinted at by observing the game's environment. 2 of the 5 pathways leading up to the 5 serial killers are opened up with these claw-like objects that allow you to interact with the souls as they seep out of these suspended corpses. These bodies will teleport you over to Live Side, where you'll end up fighting one of the 5 serial killers. The things that are propping these bodies open are the same items that you pick up and use on the remaining 3. A careful observer will note the similarities between the item that the player has in their inventory and the ones that you encounter in the environment. And if you can figure out to put 2 and 2 together, you might be encouraged enough to experiment and see if the item will actually work the way you might envision it to. Shadow Man, therefore, puts the onus on you to explore and see what you can find. all while maintaining a strong sense of level design that feels as if those looping hallways and locked doors all have a consistent, logical framework in the way they interlock with each other. Very few hallways are actually wasted and lead to dead ends. More often than not, they'll lead to a door that you can open up elsewhere in the level, and thus it'll act like a shortcut. The game's sense of exploration is further deepened by the fact that the game doesn't have a map of any kind. Now, while this would normally frustrate me, I found that Shadow Man's levels were compact enough and so uniquely and individually crafted that oftentimes a map was totally unnecessary. Levels have a logical flow to them, and it's easy to see how they interconnect. More importantly, however, is that the game's areas all feel unique. And even if some textures are reused in some areas, the levels themselves are designed in such a way that they don't feel like they're copy-pasted from other areas. Each area has its own features and its own charms and its own characteristics, and so even without a map, it's not too difficult to navigate. You'll remember certain areas and hallways as you explore, and so while you might get turned around every so often, you'll actually find yourself on paths that you recognize. Getting lost, however, is part of the game, so don't expect to be able to instantly know where you are at all times. Nevertheless, the game's levels themselves impressed me with its thematic consistency, and despite not being an open world, technically, it certainly felt as though there was an interlink between those stages. Remember earlier when I talked about the lava flow going into the asylum and powering up the machines? That's present throughout the entire game. You have a sense that all of the areas sort of feed into each other one way or another, and thus the world feels logical and connected. And if you get overwhelmed by the world's size, don't fret. There is that warp system to let you quickly and conveniently travel between stages to make all that backtracking as painless as possible. You just need to get far enough in order to trigger the warp point. Although, there are a few times when the gap between your objective and the spawn is long enough that dying while excavating a temple or a boss can get tiresome, this was the exception, not the rule. And all that backtracking comes to a head when you hunt down those elusive Dark Souls. And part of the reason as to why there's so much backtracking is because Shadow Man is very much influenced by Metroidvanias. In order to get the game's most powerful weapon, an automatic nail gun appropriately called the Violator, you'll need to open up the case that is locked in using keys that are hidden in the final boss areas later in the game. While there are 5 in total, you only really need 3 of them, because the other 2 are used to collect the ammunition for it, and once you pick up the gun, the ammo will spawn in the world anyway. Nevertheless, you need to have a large number of souls in order to get to the areas where these items are hidden in the first place. And then on top of it, you have to find the hidden keys, then go back to the area where the Violator is located, and then use them to pick up your gun. And you likely won't even be able to do this until you're ready to go to the final boss anyway. It's a tangled web of exploration and backtracking, but again, despite the way I'm making it sound, Shadow Man actually pulls this off really well, provided that you have the tolerance for it. Regardless, once you collect those 95 souls, you may as well just stop hunting them down anyway. For the sake of this review, I went ahead and collected all of the Dark Souls in the game, just so I can open up that one single level 10 coffin gate that's to be found in the very first area of the game. And what did I receive for my troubles? Concept art. Fucking concept art. Yay! Inside of the chamber of the level 10 Shadow Gate is an item called the Book of Shadows, and scrolling through it is just a bunch of concept art for the game. Which, okay, I'll admit, it looks really cool, but concept art? Really? This is especially irritating since in the N64 version of the game, you get a second Violator to dual wield and make that final boss fight all the easier. The poem that you get thanking you for playing the game is nice, but come on man, what a letdown. Even the Book of Shadows itself has a much more interesting function in the N64 version. Rather than being found at the end of the game and being filled with fucking concept art, you'll unlock it as soon as you unlock the cheat code. Then from that point on, you just use the item to turn cheats on and off, rather than on the PC where you quit the game, go to the main menu, go to the cheat menu, turn it on, and then reload your save. The whole thing is really a sticking point for me since the trade-off for fully completing the game just isn't worth it. And the cheat codes are, well, they're not so much cheat codes as they are fun unlockables that definitely feel as if they're from a bygone era, because they are. Throughout the game, you may occasionally get a pop-up that says Secret Unlocked after wandering through a certain area. These secrets just mostly change Michael's skin in some way, like making him invisible, mostly, or covering him in flames. Sometimes they'll change his model completely, like allowing you to play as a dog. It doesn't change any of the mechanics at all, however. Then there's some other ones that are just a little more far out, like disco mode. For Shadow Man, I love that they're included. No matter how small it is, and no matter how useless quote-unquote it is, they're fun, and it tickles the part of my heart that makes me remember what gaming was like decades ago. If you're interested in seeing Shadow Man's concept art, I put a video of it up on my second channel with the link to the description below. So, do I recommend Shadow Man? Absolutely. Shadow Man is an excellent game that knows exactly what it wants to do and it executes it wonderfully. Though it has some annoyances here and there, it's very well put together and a real joy to play. Not once during my playthrough did I feel annoyed during my quest to find all of the Dark Souls and put an end to the apocalypse. Though, I will say that you do need to have a tolerance for a Metroidvania collectathon type of game. And I think that you definitely need to be ready for a bit of trial and error when it comes to experiencing Shadow Man. Or, you know, you can always just use a guide. There's one bundled in with the extras in the GOG version of the game if you choose to get it there. And if you're the sort of gamer who can't stand old games because they look ugly, Shadow Man is supposed to get a remaster that's due to release sometime this year. 4K resolution options, updated textures, improved lighting, X-input controller support, and the thing that has me the most excited, restoration of cut content. If you don't want to wait, however, you can get the original game on either GOG or Steam, and it works just fine, more or less. So, if you're itching for the chance to take a lengthy stroll around the bloody fountains of Deadside and embrace the horror of it all, look no further than Shadow Man.